Welcome to the Profile Corner. Today's video is part 2 of the video series creating a work table for the 3D printer. In the last video, I milled up the stock from rough cut lumber into flat boards using the radial arm saw, jointer, planer, and table saw. And now I've got laid out here on the workbench in front of me the boards that'll become the top of the work table. I managed to find 3 of the black walnut boards that were completely clear, so I'll use those for the top surface. And then I have additional boards back here that'll be used for the lower shelf and also for the stretcher. I have not yet laid those out, but I have laid out the boards that'll be used for the top of the work table. Unfortunately, since these boards were jointed and planed a day or two ago, they've already started to warp up and down, and so that's going to pose a little bit of an issue for me when it's time to glue these together. I have 3 boards here. I only need 2.5 of the boards, so I'll probably cut one of the boards down to size slightly so that the total width is a little bit over 2 feet. And then what I'll do is I'll use my biscuit jointer and I'll put in biscuits at various locations along the length, and that will help me remove the vertical height difference of these boards and get them down to exactly the same level, and that way I don't have any issues with having to sand these boards down after they're glued up. Okay, now I need to lay out the boards for the lower shelf. And here's what I'm thinking to use for the layout of the lower shelf. And I've got some sapwood in here, and what I figured out here is that the bottom shelf is also going to be 24 inches wide. I've got a little bit over 25 inches up until I run into the sapwood on this side of the board. So what I can do is I can make a cut here at 25¼ inches, right there, whatever that distance is, so I can cut back and get rid of the sapwood. And I've got the boards for the bottom shelf laid out. I drew in a triangle here so that I can get these back into the same position later on. And I marked out the locations of where the biscuits are going, more or less every couple inches down. These boards are mostly straight, at least these 2 are. This board here seems to have popped up a bit, and so these biscuits should really help with the alignment. So I'm going to get the biscuits out, and then we'll get busy clamping these together. I'm using number 10 biscuits into slots that were cut for number 20 biscuits, because I think that my biscuit joiner is not cutting the number 20 biscuit slots quite deep enough. So these number 10 biscuits fit just fine. I won't bother gluing in the biscuits, because they're not really going to add much strength. However, they'll be adding in alignment capabilities here that I wouldn't have otherwise. Okay, so I'll get the tabletop glued up exactly the same way. I'll let this glue set up for about an hour or two, probably about an hour and a half, and then I'll come back and use my paint scraper on it to take it off just as it's starting to set up. And then I'll wipe down the workbench as soon as I finish getting everything glued up, because I didn't put down any kind of protective paper on the workbench. Now the work table top is glued up now. I'll have to wait an hour and a half to 2 hours for the glue to set up so that I can scrape off the excess of amount of glue that came out. I'm ready to start routing the mortises now. I've got an edge guide set up so that I can take off this section here. I've got to make sure that I've got the edge guide always on the outside of the leg on all of these boards. So I've got all these boards oriented the same way. So what I'll do is I'll cut these mortises on these faces first, and then I'll flip the boards over. The unfortunate thing is that my router bit here only has 1.5 inch cutting length, and I've got the router set to cut 1 5/8 inches deep, so that it allows a little bit of room at the bottom of the mortise for the glue to go. And so probably what's going to happen is that I'm going to get some smoke on the first initial plunges. So what I'll do is I'll plunge down on each end, and then because I've got the edge guide over on this side of the router, that means that I should move the router toward the camera when I'm making a sweeping pass. Okay, so let's get started here. to stop here, I hit a little bit of ejection of some sort of a piece of metal from the router. Let me go take a look and see what that was. Now, this piece of metal came off the router, and I'm not real sure. Oh, that's the plunge stopper. Well, that's not good that that flew off. So I'll have to try to get that reattached. Hopefully it didn't do too much damage to the blade when it hit it. Okay, so I just need to repeat this process on all the remaining legs, hopefully without that depth stopper popping off again. And with going in a straight line here, I tend to end up with a little bit smoother wall for the mortises than going straight down. The straight down approach would probably be faster, but it would leave a rougher edge over here on the side. And I'm looking for a smooth wall for enhanced glue adhesion. Yeah, I was getting quite a bit of smoke when I was using that other router bit that made contact with the metal stopper that sets the depth of cut. And so I actually saw some sparks fly off of the router bit as I was making the last mortise. And so what I've done is I've switched over to another 1/2 inch wide router bit. This one also has an 1.5 inch cutting depth, which means that I'll probably get burning again once the router bit makes it all the way down to the bottom, because I'm cutting a little bit deeper than 1.5 inches. Looks like I'm actually going down 1 9/16 inches. Okay, so let's get started on the second side of the legs. Router bit is definitely doing a better job at not burning so much. And so what I'll do is I'll finish up cutting mortises into the other 3 legs, and then I'll square up the ends of these mortises using a chisel. I've just started the process of filling in some voids in these boards, and I've mixed up a little bit of sawdust and wood glue, and I figured that I'd give that a shot, and if that doesn't work, then I'll try to use some of the Starbond, which is a black superglue, to fill in the voids. And hopefully one of these two make these voids look not so bad. And I'm just doing the legs for right now. And then I'll come back and I'll sand them down later on once the glue's had time to set up. And I am using quite a bit of glue here. These legs look decent now. Now I'll get to cutting the stretchers, and then we'll start cutting the tenons into the ends of the stretchers. And now I'm working on calculating the length of the aprons. If the table is going to be 48 inches long, and I'm going to have a 2-inch overhang on each side, that means that these legs on the outside have to be spaced out 44 inches apart. And then if I subtract from that 5 inches, which is the combined height of these legs, or the combined width of these legs, then that leaves me with 39 inches. And then I need to add on 1.5 inches for the tenon length here and also here. So I need to add on a total of 3 inches. And that gives me 42 inches for the length of these apron boards, the long dimension. The shorter dimension, I could just subtract 6 inches, because that's what I did essentially here. Subtracted 6 inches from the total length to get to 42. So if I start out with 24 inches, subtract 6 from that, then I end up with 18 inches for the side aprons. So I'll head over to the radial arm saw now, and I'll cut these boards down to the final length. I have a stop block set up over here at 18 inches from the blade. So what I'll do is I'll square up the one end of these boards, and then I'll slide the board across to the stop, and then cut the other end. The fence is not quite long enough on this radial arm saw for me to set up a stop block at 42 inches from the blade. And so what I've done is I've actually set up the stop block on the fence for the other radial arm saw that's just to my right. So I'll do the same process here. I'll cut off the end and then slide the board down until it makes contact with the stop block, and then I'll cut it again. Okay, the next step is to put tenons on the ends of these boards. I have the rip fence set so that it's 1.5 inches away from this edge of the blade, and so that'll give me the right position for the kerf in these tenons. So I'll run the boards through flat on both ends, and then once I've run all the boards through, including those that I have over here, then I'll raise the blade up to 1/2 inch and run the boards through on edge. The blade is up 1/8 of an inch right now. Unfortunately, the blade height on this saw sometimes has a tendency to drift, and it's actually drifted from an inch all the way to, looks like just under a quarter inch, so you can start to an inch. It hasn't done that to me in quite some time, but that's the on occasion, even when I hit lock down. And also, blade height to an eighth of an inch. I'm using a profile blade here with 40 teeth. This is a manufactured by the blade. And the profile blade, of course, has flat round teeth on the top. So that you get a nice cut. That looks good. Now I'm going to burst around edge. I'll try to take off just less than an eighth of an inch on the outside here, on both sides, and then I'll see how close I am to this being a half inch wide. It's oversized by about 32nd of an inch, so when you move it in, about 64th. Let's get that shot. It looks like it's about 64th of an inch oversized. The light looks good. Okay, so now I need to reset the position of the work fence so I can cut the shoulders here at half inch. So what I'm looking for is 3 inches to this side of the blade. Just make sure that the half inch here. That looks good. Okay, next what I need to do is do a test fit of these boards in the legs, and then I need to fill some of the voids that are in these boards also. I'll be doing that with either a mixture of sawdust and wood glue or the Starbond superglue. I'm not seeing any issues with the dry fit of the shorter boards that'll go into the sides. I do have a little bit of an issue that I knew that I would have, in that I'll have some interference inside here. The tenon from this board is protruding into this mortise roughly 3/16 of an inch, and so what I'll need to do then is actually apply a 3/16 inch bevel onto the end of each one of these boards on the side that'll make contact with the other tenon. And so I'll get started on that now. I've set up some stop blocks in the work table here, and so now what I'll do is I'll just take a chisel and apply that bevel onto those tenons. And obviously I'll do this on the inside face of these boards. I'll try to select a nicer looking face as the outside face. Okay, so I've got these longer boards done now with the bevel on the end. And so what I'll do is I'll take the shorter boards out of the legs, and then I'll apply the same type of a chamfer onto the ends of those aprons. Let's try to fill a couple of these small voids with some Starbond. Yeah, I've got to fix some voids on the other side of one of these boards. I've got to wait for this to set up. I also have some accelerator from some other super glue that hardened on me. I'll let that cure for a little while, and while that's curing, I'll go on to doing the same process onto the shelf board to fill the voids in it. And let's do a little bit of sanding on the bottom of the shelf to see if we can get rid of the high spots from this filler. looks like I need a little more filler right here. This sanding pad is a little bit gummed up at the moment. I'll get a fresh sheet of sandpaper on here, and then I'll switch this over to full rotation mode, and then that should allow me to address this area here, which is still showing the rough sawn area of the board, and also up in here. And the turbo sanding mode has been turned on. That's taking care of the low spots. I can still see a shadow of the rough sawn texture here. I don't think that's going to be an issue, but I'm going to turn off the turbo mode, put it back over to regular random orbit mode. This is the bottom of the tabletop. Just need to lightly level it. I use biscuits when I put these joints together, and so that should mean that I should need to do very little leveling, none on the top. I should be able to take these two boards the tabletop and the shelf over to the table saw and cut them to final dimensions. I cut the boards to width while I still had the rip profile blade installed on the table saw. Okay, the other board gets cut to 20 inches wide. This one was cut to 24. Okay, now I'll swap over to the 40-tooth combination blade on the saw. This board needs to be cut to 44 inches long. I'll square up one end first. This board gets cut to 48 inches long. I'll split one end first. Okay, so now we've got to work on the legs a little bit. I want to add a little bit of a detail to the corners of those legs. Hey, let's test this a bit out and see if that works for us. And here's the profile that we ended up with. It's kind of an interesting profile. Now I wonder if I can turn this piece on edge and route it again. Okay, so we ended up with kind of a interesting little detail here. And just make sure that, okay, so if we run that, we'll have bearing contact here, so we should be okay. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll run that on all four edges of these boards. And we'll hope that it's going to work out okay for us. Okay, so now I've got to get the stretcher sanded up, and then we can start the glue up of the base. Here's the way the boards look on the end. It's kind of an interesting design. table legs loosely laid out and how they'll be positioned when the table is assembled. I'll start out by gluing in the short aprons. I applied an oil and wax finish onto the stretchers that are remaining, as well as the assemblies that were glued up with the legs and the stretchers. And now what I'm going to do while I'm waiting for that to cure is that I'm going to put an edge profile on the top of the workbench table. And I picked out a router bit. I believe this is called an ogee fillet router bit. Should be an interesting profile. Okay, so that went pretty quick, and I did take a full depth pass of cut. And if you've got a smaller motor in your router, you may not want to take that all off in one pass. You could take it off in steps. As you can see here, I've got a little bit of a reveal at the top. And so what I'll do is I'll take some 120 sandpaper and just lightly touch that off so that it's not a sharp edge. And that finish turned out pretty nice. I'll apply a similar finish to the shelf. Applying a finish to it will probably complicate the process of notching out around the legs, but I think that I can manage that with a finish on it. And then I've got to wait for all this finish to cure, obviously. I'm still waiting for the 3D printer to finish printing the pads for the bottoms of the legs. That should be done within the half hour, as long as the filament doesn't get stuck again. And then we can continue with the glue up of this project. I ran into a little bit of an issue with the 3D printer using this gold Polymaker PLA. Unfortunately, when the printer got roughly a quarter of the way through the print job, it could no longer feed in this PLA from Polymaker. So he was able to print with that gold PLA for a little while, and then a quarter of the way through the print job, it just halted, saying that it could no longer feed in the PLA. I got it going again, and then it stopped after a few more minutes with the same error message, cannot feed the PLA in, or something to that effect. So I took out the PLA, put it back in again, and it looked like it was running, and it ran for a total of 3.5 hours, and apparently it printed nothing but air for the last 3/4 of the run. And so these plates that are supposed to be a 1/2 inch thick are only about an 1/8 inch thick, maybe. And so they're not going to work. I tried putting in some Prusa PLA, and it won't feed that in. I went back to the Polymaker black PLA, which is what I used last about 1.5 to 2 weeks ago, and it's not able to feed that in either, or feed it through the extruder anyway. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do about that. Anyway, this is just another one of those things that comes up. So we'll put that aside for right now. And now I'm getting ready to do the glue up here. I'll be using Titebond 3 for this glue up, whereas I used Titebond 2 for the last glue up. This will give me a little bit longer open time in case it takes a little bit longer to do the assembly. I have one of the ends down here on the floor, and it's sitting on top of 1/4 inch MDF, just so that it doesn't get scarred up by the floor. And so now what I'll start doing is applying this glue onto the tenons that are over here, and then I'll pound those tenons in. It's a little dark in the shop right now. The power's been out here for about an hour. What I've been doing is I've been installing these balsam point figure 8 units into the table apron here so that I can use that to anchor down the tabletop and also the shelf that's down here. And these are designed so that you can use a 5/8 inch Forstner drill bit if you drill it so that the center of the drill bit is about 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch from the edge of this board. Then these are able to pivot as the tabletop expands and contracts throughout the year. And of course, it's only going to expand and contract across the width of the grain. It won't expand much along the length of the grain. And what I've done is that I've put in 2 of these on each end, close to the edges. I had originally put in one here, another one down here, and then 2 here. I took out the one here and also this one because I was concerned that the tabletop may not be able to expand if I've got one in here. Whereas if I've got one here, this apron is able to kick out a little bit to allow this board to expand if it needs to. I don't know if I'll be getting much expansion out of it. It's more than likely it's going to shrink down. It's quite hot in that shed where the 3D printer will be located. So I've already got these in place, and then I've got some screws here that are about 1.25 inches long that I use to sink into the aprons. And then I bought a package of 5/8 inch long screws that I can use to drill up into the table surface and also the shelf. And now what I've done is I've laid out the location of where these legs are going to be at on the shelf, because I need to notch out the shelf. I'll need to have one notch out on each end where the legs are at. And then obviously over on the other side also. And I made these so that they're wider than necessary. They're up to, I believe, 3/16 of an inch wider than necessary. And that's important in this dimension here, in case this board expands. I could probably go smaller than that, but I decided to go that size. I had planned on using my jigsaw to cut that out, and if I was going to use a jigsaw to cut that out, I was going to make these marks on the bottom side of the shelf because it's the side that is closest to the jigsaw that ends up getting the roughest surface. But since I don't have any power in the shop right now, what I'll do is I'll actually use my hand saw to cut that. I've got a Japanese pull saw, so I'll get started working on that, cutting out these notches here, and then I should be able to drop this shelf in down below and then secure it in place. I managed to get the shelf in, and I was quite lucky that I didn't have this shelf up maybe even a 1/2 inch higher than it is right now. So right now the shelf is 16 3/4 of an inch from the top of this apron, and that's with it installed. If I had made it 1/2 inch further up, I would not have been able to twist the shelf into place. I was lucky also that I allowed a sufficient gap over at the sides next to the legs, because that allowed me a little bit of extra wiggle room. Okay, so I've got to get this secured into place by sinking screws into the figure 8 hooks underneath here. I have the tabletop mounted upside down on the workbench, and I've marked off 2 inches from this edge here and also this edge all the way around, and that's where I'll place the top of the legs when I put it onto this surface. I'll work on that next. The tabletop is mounted onto the legs and the aprons, So I'll get this flipped over, and then hopefully you'll be able to see it. The power's still out here, and so this has been kind of an interesting end to an interesting project. There's the finished work table for the 3D printer. That black walnut shows off its grain really nicely, even in a dim-lighted workshop. I think that this table turned out to be pretty nice, even though we faced a few challenges here and there. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.